Amazon.
Got it. All right, professors. Wow, to have two PhDs. I don't know much about how the world works, but to both of you have a PhD. But I think you need a high school diploma, and then you need an undergraduate degree, and then a master's degree, and then you get a PhD. And I don't even know how many years that takes. But what a privilege to be with both of you. This is our 20th show, I think. Professor Tootle and I do these every Friday. And when we wanted to start talking about the military, he goes, yeah, I know a bunch about U.S. history, but there's a guy who knows more about military history than I've ever, he's forgotten more than I've ever learned. You got to talk to Professor Brasino. So Professor Brasino, we brag about Professor Tootle all the time. He is really a pretty thoughtful character out in the world. And we met at the American Enterprise Institute, and we both are kind of on a mission to have people understand how society works and what the role of citizenship is in relationship to our history and what the role of America is. And so we're pretty proud of what we're trying to do. But now this is the first time ever we've had somebody so sophisticated, dignified, or so credible. Heck, you work at the Army War College? Is that still true? Is that where you're teaching now?
Yeah, I teach in the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
Wow. Take just a second for us to tell us, because you're a Colorado guy, and for a native of Colorado, me, that brings remarkable pride to my life by having you be from Colorado. Why don't you tell us who you are real quick?
Okay, yeah. So I'm originally from Ohio, so I sort of consider myself more of a Ohio boy. But I went to high school and college in Colorado, and I'm proud of that too. I went to a small school called Adams State. It's now Adams State University. It was Adams State College when I went there. So the tattoo is wrong on my shoulder now, but it's what my diploma says. So it's all good. I played football at Adams State. I was going to be a high school teacher, social studies teacher, and a coach. And when I was in school, kind of realized that what I really liked, that I liked history so much, loved doing it, the history stuff too much, that I didn't want to be limited by the sort of social studies realm. So that's kind of what happened, and the education world, and kind of how it works with all of the certifications and things that are, I think, limiting for people who want to know more about their subject. But that could be a whole other conversation. Anyway, so I decided to go to grad school. Went to grad school. Wasn't really sure what I wanted to specialize in, and then kind of figured out that, I could do something that was my hobby for a living. So when you're reading Longest Day when you're 12 years old, reading about D-Day and things like that, and you realize I could do this and get paid for it. Maybe not paid a lot, but get paid for it. I'll do that. So I went into American military history as a focus. Started with World War II stuff. Now I'm working on World War I. I've done a few other things, kind of bounced around doing that. Got the PhD at Ohio University. And then through some kind of weird luck, I ended up at the U.S. Army Center for Military History, which is in Washington, D.C. They publish the official histories that you sometimes see. If you look, all right, the green ones, those green books there, that's all Center of Military History guys about World War II. So those are pretty famous, a lot of those books. So I worked there for a little while, and then I went out to Kansas and worked at the Combat Studies Institute, which is more sort of using history to help the force now, more directly help the force now, a little bit less doing sort of applied history. And then taught at a place called the School of Advanced Military Studies, which is at Fort Leavenworth. It's part of the Command and General Staff College. Kind of officers in the middle part of their career go through there, have to go through these various command and staff colleges for the different services. And then 4 years ago, I came out here to the Army War College. And Army War College is for more senior people going on to become, maybe become generals, but certainly, senior colonels, the folks who really run the joint force. It's what we call all the services together. So that's what I do. Teach the Army War College.
We're claiming you from Colorado. So thank you for taking those years and decades of study to help future generations of military folks protect and serve our country. Thank you for your role in all that. Professor Tootle, if you'll just take a couple lines on your background as well, because you're going to add some color commentary during the discussion.
Well, I met Tom in grad school, and we both went to Ohio University, and Tom left some of the stuff about his background out that I find most interesting. But number one, he came to Ohio because there was a professor there who wrote biography of the first Black general, and Tom ended up doing a lot of stuff that was kind of intellectual history, cultural history, social history of the military, but in addition, straight military history. And then ended up writing this book, Nation Forged in War, about how the World War II experience really changed America's ethnic consciousness. Really great book. There it is. Yeah. In addition to that, one of the other things that he did was he really got to use history in a practical sense during the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, he was writing history that was being applied to the battlefield, and a couple of those ended up becoming books. And Tom can clarify some of these, but I remember the one on transnational warfare and border incursions. I mean, these are things that the military had requested. He would write history that would then be used to inform what the military was actually doing to win a war. So he did a lot of important work. So he's a rare expert in that he has this expertise in political and military history that informs his military history, but also this side of him that has had a lot of stuff actually practically applied. And the kind of stuff that he does at his position now in the War College is also very different than a traditional academic job. And it gives him a really unique perspective that I think you're going to see come through in the discussion today.
Love it, love it, love it. So Professor Brasino, you're going to crack up a little bit at some of my questions, because although I have a high school diploma and an undergraduate degree in political science and a law degree, and I enlisted in the Army and then went through OCS and became a captain, serving under Colonel Joe Rice, you'll be somewhat surprised at the naivety of my questions. But that's okay. You're going to be able to answer them however you wish, that can give the most insight to fellow Americans trying to understand our government and society and their role in it. Let's start at the beginning, and we only have 20 minutes, and I have 11 questions and 20 minutes, and then we're going to have it open it up to whoever is still on the call with us for another half hour. So we'll see what kind of questions they have. But I do think it's always important to start at the very beginning, to kind of understand the culture and the history, the traditions. What is it like to be an American? And during the Revolutionary War, I'm pretty sure I learned this in Littleton Public Schools. It was a bunch of farmers and adventurers out in the wilderness that shot at redcoats through the trees, and we beat the most powerful nation on earth. The sun never sets on the British Empire, with a bunch of revolutionaries. Tell us about the setting of the founding of our country and the role of its military, because I have a layman's perspective that the military is both loved and feared by its own citizens. Tell us however you'd like to tell us in a couple minutes.
Yeah, so I think it's one of the questions you did in the kind of lead up for this was to ask about what makes the United States military unique, and I think that there's some foundational stuff that's really important to understand about the United States. So there's a couple of things that make the United States military unique in the world. Less so now, but certainly at its founding, very unique this way. So one of those, about the United States is so there's really two aspects that make the United States, conditions that make the United States unique. Number one is the sort of the nature of its founding, nature of its governmental system, right? So a fundamentally democratic, small d democratic system, and sort of run through a filter of constitutionalism, kind of a British constitutionalism that's transplanted into this effectively a wilderness, across the Atlantic Ocean. So with these, so your point of what you learned is true, but it's only part of the story, right? It's only part of it. American people are pretty fiercely independent they have a sort of intuitive kind of a grasp of their own sort of freedom, free will to do the things that they would like to do. It's sort of inherent in the type of people who came to the colonies. And they're very jealous. They very jealously guard that freedom, that independence. And so there's one, kind of multiple threats to that. So, one of them is natives on the frontier, Native Americans on the frontier, certain Native American tribes that were hostile, which they see as a threat. And we always have to remember this. This is pre-revolution time. These threats are very, these are existential threats to them. Meaning they could be wiped out, like their existence ends in these threats. So I just got back I was just spent last weekend in Rhode Island, and I was out in Bristol, Rhode Island. And this is the spot where King Philip's War happened. And where King Philip, so we tried to go to King Philip's chair, but Brown University's covered up the spot now, and you can't get into it. But King Philip's War is, so you were talking about dates and stuff. Historians, we like to use dates. We like dates because dates tell us sequence, and sequence helps us understand kind of cause to the degree you can have cause. Sort of balancing cause and contingency. So King Philip's War is 100 years before the American Revolution. Everybody kind of knows 1776. People know that date usually pretty well. So he's a figure 1676 is King Philip's War, and it's this big nasty war. And the way that the people fight it is because it's existential. They come to the conclusion they have to wipe out these enemy forces. So this is part of what happens in King Philip's War, and it's when it becomes kind of embedded, these kind of wars of total victory. Whatever that requires. They would prefer to follow the sort of normal rules of warfare, but it doesn't work out that way. So you have that, right? So you have this this tendency to be sort of jealously guard your freedom and fight this thing. The other thing, though, is who's going to do the fighting, and it tends to be sort of this is the people doing the fighting, right? So this is this question. They're not feudal lords who are doing the defense for you. They're not bringing along sort of peasants with them. These are free people, free landholders who are jealously guarding what they own, what they have in their lives. So they go out and fight this stuff. They're also inheriting a very British tradition of mistrust for standing armies, which drives into this, because standing armies are also a threat at home. The United States has a very unique situation. And so this gets to the other aspect. So part of that is that, this idea of having free people who are jealously guarding that freedom and are willing to use overwhelming force to protect that freedom, to protect what they have, freedom and all that it means. The other aspect of it is geographic. The United States, and this is sort of something it's kind of obvious, but we don't think about it, right? The United States is very well buffered. We have oceans on either side of us. We only have two neighbors. They're pretty distant when you think about it. The Canadian American frontier is not a very good terrain to fight in. It's pretty nasty. There's only a few ways in and out. So we tend to be pretty well protected. The Mexican government and the Mexican threat tends to be pretty limited, and it's far away from a lot of our sort of key places. So we have this kind of free security, which allows us to actually not have large standing armies. And then to sort of have a consideration about just how much of a Navy do we need? Is it just to keep people off of our coasts, or is it to go out and project power? And that's something that changes over time. So now all that said, when the wars do happen, so the other thing is that the Americans don't like standing militaries, especially don't like standing armies, but they're pretty belligerent. Americans tend to get into fights quite a bit, at least once a generation, a big one. It seems to be the pattern that we're on. So we do need a military that is capable of dealing with all of the various contingencies that we find ourselves in, the different fights that we find ourselves in. And this is true in the American Revolution. So there is there's a lot more professionalism in American military history than is commonly believed prior to the 20th century. They were pretty good about getting after it and learning from Europeans. I mean, they knew the stuff that was out there. George Washington was a pretty good student of warfare. Nathaniel Greene kind of jumps in. He's a very good student of warfare. And as time goes on, they get more and more professional as they go. Sort of go from your kind of leading people to leading people, Winfield Scott, to somebody like Ulysses S. Grant, who's a much more learned officer than people realize. William Tecumseh Sherman, same thing. These are kind of military intellectuals and more professional than people usually think. They're not just these kind of guys who pragmatically muddle their way through using, sort of good old, common sense in fighting.
Let me interrupt you with two questions first, because I think what John was getting at is you learn this version of the Revolutionary War that it was, the militias hiding in the wilderness that won the war. And I had stated, maybe overstated, but I stated that no, the success of the revolution depended on George Washington and the regular army continuing to maintain themselves as a fighting force. And I think that's what he was getting at. We have this perception that the regular army was not essential to winning the American Revolution.
Yeah, no. So the Continental Army, as it forms, is essential to winning the American Revolution, certainly, and the diplomatic efforts that went along with that to bring in the French and the Spanish on our side, take advantage of their historical animosity towards the British and bring them in. And the French Navy was key. Lafayette and the rest of the French leaders and some French ground forces, but particularly the French Navy, were essential to this. But the ability to have a standing army in the field and keep it in the field made it too costly for the British to keep up the fight. So I mean, and what we're really talking about is, which often happens, people sort of mixing up strategy and tactics. So, tactically, the United States military fought in a variety of ways, and it was somewhat different. So it does tend to be more open order types of fighting. So it's a little bit less of getting in lines and fighting, these sort of set piece battles the way you see in Europe. That way, they do tend to be a little bit more open order. Americans, another thing that's really interesting is Americans don't use cavalry the same. And this gets into the sort of weeds of tactics. But here's a unique attribute of the United States. The United States never uses cavalry in battle the way that you see in something like Braveheart, right? You see cavalry charges on a battlefield to break up, to go. If you understand sort of warfare in the 1700s and 1800s, in the Napoleonic War, you kind of have it. It's sort of a rock paper scissors thing. So cavalry beats artillery beats infantry beats cavalry. In certain formations, that's the way it works in the battles in Europe. But that's not how the Americans use. We use cavalry for more for reconnaissance, screening, small skirmishing, that kind of thing. But not to go and attack the artillery parks in a battle. It's the anniversary of Waterloo was yesterday or today. Yesterday. But if you ever see that, there's a really good Waterloo movie for showing the battle and showing like what happens when cavalry attacks infantry squares in those battles. You could sort of see in these movies, but that's not how American warfare on the United States happens. And even when we go on the road, we don't fight that way either with cavalry.
So, Professor, let me interrupt. Professor Tootle, did you say you had two questions?
The second one was, so the first one was about the nature. The second one I was going to ask you is just clarify another point that I've made is who was in the militia, because it becomes contentious. We in a previous episode, we talked about the Second Amendment applying to only the militia, but it's kind of interesting to find out who was in the militia and who wasn't.
Yeah, so I mean, militia is really everybody. I mean that's every able-bodied male of able-bodied of the certain age groups.
That when people say it's limited to only everyone, when you say it's limited to the militia, it's the militia was everybody. So
yeah, so that's one of those. It's a really interesting thing. It sort of complicates our story. I don't, to your point, Stephen, I don't think that they separated the Second Amendment, the sort of the defense against government tyranny and the ability to have a well-regulated militia that could be converted to a significant fighting force, field armies, those are the same things for them. They're not seeing them as entirely different. The way that we tend to separate them. That's a mistake. In fact, that the phraseology of a well-regulated militia is in Washington's recommendation for how the United States should build its military. That's what he uses, that same phrasing. Him and Alexander Hamilton write a document about a well-regulated militia that's pretty good about this, and it kind of, you can sort of see the way that those the right to bear arms, and again, keeping in mind that one of the great threats is the government, is potentially the government, and a standing army. So if it's a well-regulated militia made up of the people, then it's by definition not a standing army in the way that they're talking a standing professional army.
And there are times, when this matters. I was just reading about these incursions by slave catchers into southern Pennsylvania, where armed Black citizens would call out the militia themselves in order to enforce Pennsylvania law, which said that those slave catchers couldn't come into their towns. And so you had instances where you could say this was one state or one locality, one municipality with a militia that was enforcing state law. So the interaction between how citizens thought of themselves was just, hey, we're fellow citizens. There's a threat to the law that is present in and it would have been the same if slave catchers are coming to southern Pennsylvania, or if Native Americans are attacking. There's a violent threat that is attacking the civil law in your locality.
Right. It's in the same sense that if there's an emergency now, we think to maybe you call out the National Guard for an emergency, right? Like effectively they were calling out themselves, as a militia. So it's a continuation of that. It's a more organized version of it. But it effectively works, very similarly, except for that it's a little bit more centralized at the state level. So it's governors doing this more than local local governments, cities, towns, townships that would call out their own.
So Professor, we only have 5 more minutes left of my time, and we went through one of our first 11 questions.
Yes.
So I guess what I'd suggest is this: you've been a rock climber. You're from Colorado, so you went up to the foothills and took some ropes and you climbed. Maybe we just give a handhold or two on a variety of other topics, and then see what our friends are willing to ask on top of it, or maybe they'll ask something totally different. So I have extensive understanding of history because I watched Hamilton. And I know that George Washington decided not to be a king, because that's what the king was surprised that he didn't do. So it's not just the Second Amendment. Right in our Constitution, they put in that Congress has the power to declare war, et cetera, et cetera. That fear of a standing army runs deep. Congressional oversight committees, et cetera, et cetera. Is there anything else you'd like to add from the founding of our country that has helped us be successful to this time because our founders were so wise? At 30 seconds.
Oh, 30 seconds. So I think that it goes back to this point of the checks and balances, and the many checks and balances that are built into our system. The army is, so the way the Constitution is written, the Congress has the power to raise armies, and then maintain a navy. Navies are, ships are harder to make, build, keep upkeep. Armies are theoretically easier to raise, and then you save yourself from the risk of having these standing armies running around. It's just something that is so obvious. It's so obvious that we don't see it, which is that we don't. You think about other countries around the world and how often their military lives among the people. When you're in the military or in the military environment like I am, you see military guys all the time, and so you think that this is, you can kind of forget that this is not how it is for most people. When I was a kid in Ohio and Colorado, if you saw the military guys, if you saw a convoy going down the highway, they were moving troops from one spot to another. Kids are, your face was pressed up against the glass looking at the tanks. that are going by. It was this amazing thing because you don't see them. Just like after September 11th, it was very sort of. I think it was one of the things is when you saw the National Guard at airports, you saw people in uniform carrying M16s, M4s, whatever, and you're going, man, like this is not right. That's not the case in most of the world, right? And most of the world, you see them, the military a lot living among people. So that ability to sort of keep it separate and that it is clearly subordinate to civilian authority is something that is a deeply embedded tradition in the United States that I think has really helped. It gets at some of the sort of civil military relations stuff we talk about a lot. And if you allow me, I'm going past my 30 seconds, but if you allow me, I think that I don't really like the civil military relations theory stuff that we talk about, these different models and theories for civil military relations. Use theories to help you understand things that you don't have rules for. And I was kind of funny, we talk about all the theories of different civil military relations. I'm like, I don't know, it's kind of written in the law in the United States. It's right there. The civilians have authority over the military. The military has to follow those orders as long as they're not illegal, unethical. So they have to, you follow those laws or you follow those rules. You follow the guidance of them, and you have to. Sometimes the military doesn't like it, oftentimes, but that's the way it is in how they look at problems. And that's a good thing.
A major differentiator between our armed forces and most military forces throughout history, correct?
Yeah, it's why you don't see. I mean, we're not a country we don't have military coups, and we haven't even really had much of a threat of them, despite the sort of Cold War. The movies that we're making it out to, the Curtis LeMay type characters were getting ready to take over the government and nuke the world. It's really never been even much of a close thing that's ever happened, and that's pretty impressive. Now how many we've had generals become presidents. We've had a lot of generals who failed to become presidents, and we forget that too. A lot of people who they tried for it and never got real far with it. Douglas MacArthur, for example. Pershing thought about it for a second, but wasn't that interested. When David Petraeus hasn't become president, I don't see too many on the horizon of these big senior leaders. And if they do, they just kind of go into the political system as opposed to taking that role as generals. And most of them are very good about, uniforms off and they are not putting it back on again. You see this right now. We've broken the rule a couple times in recent years. There's even supposed to be a gap between becoming, being a general and becoming like Secretary of Defense. And so we have both with Secretary Mattis and now Secretary Austin. We're both they went around that rule, and we could debate whether that's a particularly good thing. But it's the fact that there's a rule there and that we talk about it is important, right? We don't want that to be that's a civilian role. We don't want the military to be, we don't want that role to be filled by a general, even if that means that we get some McNamara's every once in a while.
Why? That's another whole conversation. Professor, I'm going to tie two questions together. So I can't remember if I swore to uphold the Constitution and from second lieutenant to first lieutenant, but I'm pretty sure I remember it when I was commissioned and as a captain, and then when I enlisted in the Army. So that oath of office, now I'm tying two big questions together. What the heck happened during the Civil War? How did we even survive as a country when you swore to uphold the Constitution until you don't? Can you give some perspective of how we're still even a country? Because it seems like today we're still fighting remnants of the Civil War in some ways. Just give an 1 minute conversation on whatever aspect you'd like to on that.
Yeah, so in the Civil War, I'll say that let's start with the idea that those guys, they were rebels and traitors who fought the United States. There was no Confederate States of America. There was an attempted Confederate States of America, but that's what the whole war was about. It didn't happen. So it never actually existed. That's what the whole war was about. But those guys chose to do that. Now, to try to sort of get in their heads of how they squared that circle of violating the oath, it's because they ended up with a sort of a perverse understanding of constitutionalism, and that the Constitution was simply a compact among independent states, and in their view, they could that the Constitution was being violated by the advent of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party coming to power with its agenda to end slavery, to end Black slavery. And so they see this as sort of like, hey, well, that the compact is broken, so that oath is sort of null and void, because we are loyal to our states first. No, they're wrong, and that's again what the war was about. But that is part of their logic of what they did. Now, how we survived as a country is that the American military, for a variety of reasons, and led by some pretty incredible folks like Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman and Philip Sheridan and other people from Ohio, did a remarkable job of fighting that war and crushing this rebellion militarily in a way that I think is often underestimated or boiled down to one of the big myths of American military history, is that we win wars by overwhelming material superiority. As if we pile up resources on the border, in Great Britain, and then we tip them over onto our enemy and it crushes them, or we shoot 2.5-ton trucks at them with using giant rubber bands. That's not how it works. There's a lot more that goes into how you fight, and there's been plenty of times when people had all the advantages in the world, didn't win those wars. And then that particular thing too. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I don't want to go ahead. Finish your thought on that.
Well, just there's another thing that American military, so going back to that uniqueness question, the United States military has a capability to project power that has never been seen in the world before. And it's something we forget because we're so used to it. But most American warfare is expeditionary. And if you think about the Civil War and you think about the size of the United States and how far they're going, even that's expeditionary in a way that we don't, we're like, oh yeah, well, now we can just drive down the highway and go to North Carolina, go to Savannah, right? That's a significant effort. So by way of comparison, so when the German wars of unification, the Germans get all kinds of credit, the Prussian wars and how brilliant they are at warfare. Some of the Americans after the Civil War and after the German wars of unification pointed out that if you took the whole war between Prussia and Austria, and you took the entire theater of war, it fits into a space that's half the size of Kansas. If the Germans, when they marched to Paris in 1870, had kept going and gone over the border in Spain and gone to Madrid, they would have gone as far as Sherman did when he went from Louisville to Savannah. And so you start thinking about that, it's like, wow, yeah, we're able to do stuff. And that's leaving aside when we get into even the Mexican War, but you go into the Spanish-American War, go to the Philippines. There aren't too many people in the world who could put together a corps in a matter of months, an Army corps, and ship it overseas into the Philippines, where it's able to go and fight and defeat an enemy that had been giving the Spanish all they could handle when the Spanish were already there. And then you get into World War I and World War II, and you start getting into the spectacular ability to project power overseas. That's something the United States does that no one has ever done anything like, and we do it regularly. So it's a pretty impressive thing.
I'm skipping 7 questions, obviously, because I do want to get to our friends that have been so kind to sign on and listen to us. But before I get to that, Professor Tootle, you and I have done this a lot. What is the big theme that you think that Professor Brasino may be able to share with us today that I just haven't gotten to yet? Is there something that we should explore more, whether he's willing to be Facebook friends with us, or he can send us a book or two, or see us as lecture? Is there something that we really have to get to in the next 24 minutes, or we failed our conversation today?
I think one of the things that Tom's particular expertise and the what he brings to the world as a scholar, it is really understanding the American way of war, the uniqueness of the American way of war. And he's already alluded to that a few times. Like, what is it that, he says we have this ability to project power, but it's the free institutions of ordered liberty that that when translated into a free people, what is such a in our national identity is such a powerful thing that when pointed and directed at something like violence, war making, it just unleashes something that the world has never seen. And I think Tom's, one of the things he really brings is the, at least to the richness and the depth of discussions about how social and cultural history interplay with politics into the projection of violence, but it's this, the kind of system of ordered liberty that makes us powerful. But I would like to, there are two questions in the chat that I know that I have an answer to, but I want to ask Tom these, and I'm going to rephrase them. So the first one is very common question about Lincoln. Was Lincoln acting unconstitutionally in the Civil War? And then the second one was a little pushback on the material resources and leadership question. And I guess I've already tipped my hand in that the reason you have the material resources is because of the strength of the political system. So you can't separate those two things. The reason why the North is richer is because the North is free. But anyway, I want Tom to answer the question about if Lincoln violated the Constitution.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a complicated. Like, this is something that required interpretation by the courts, by the Supreme Court in particular, on some of those matters. In general, I would say, like, the guiding principle of it, it's always complicated, right? And history is complicated. The guiding principle is no, right? Like that Lincoln was assiduously trying to follow the Constitution and be as constitutional as possible in all that he was doing. So much so that the biggest sort of controversy that we don't think of in terms of constitutionalism, we tend to think of it in terms of racism, which is the wrong way to think of it, is the delay in both emancipation and abolition of slavery. And this isn't a place to necessarily tell that whole story. Read James Oakes and his book about this. Freedom National in particular covers this really well. Sean Wilentz does this pretty well too. But this idea that he follows the Constitution so closely that it hamstrings his ability to sort of, he can't just declare things. So you have to you get into the strange circumstance of that when you're in a rebellion, you're in a war. When you're fighting a rebellion, you're fighting in a war. That removes some of the constitutional protections that you have, right? So, but not all of them, right? It required amending the Constitution to abolish slavery, which is different than emancipating slaves, which is something different. So emancipation was something that you could do. You could emancipate slaves in places that were in rebellion constitutionally, right? That was something that they were working to, and it was something they had identified as a possibility long before the Civil War. John Quincy Adams had talked about it, and so it was something that was kind of inherent in a lot of the sort of Republican Republican Party's agenda and how they looked at stuff. And I mean, this is very well laid out, and they say this stuff explicitly. In terms of some of the sort of suspension of habeas corpus and things like that, it's probably some borderline things about those are unconstitutional because there are states. So like a state like Maryland stays in the Union, but it stays in the Union, at bayonet point, right? So it's a tricky situation. They're in kind of a quasi rebellion. And so you have some of the suspension of habeas corpus, which was found to be unconstitutional, right? So but you can kind of understand why as a matter of a war fighting thing. One of the things and of course the most obvious way that he stuck with the Constitution is that he didn't suspend any elections. right? Yeah, like the constitutionally mandated elections happened, yeah, even at the potential cost of losing the war, which he thought was a very real risk in 1864. If he lost, how would we win the war? So, but it never even like crossed any of their minds to go, yeah, no elections. We'll just pause this. It's a big enough emergency that we can do that. So it was like so overwhelmingly, as a rule, was adhering to the Constitution as much as possible, with a couple of issues that end up being kind of more in the margins, where you could say, they overstepped here and there. But I certainly wouldn't make Lincoln, the way that some people try to, into like some sort of radical and violating the Constitution. I mean, his overwhelming idea was to preserve the Constitution, because the Constitution was the thing that put the principles of the Declaration of Independence into existence, as opposed to just being a statement on paper.
Yeah. But I mean, there's a constant like old Confederate, neo-Confederate argument that the rebellion only happened because of the constitutional oppressions of Abraham Lincoln. But the rebellion happened before Lincoln was president, before he was sworn in. So if you're already shooting at Army officers, if you're already shooting at the US Army and Lincoln is not the president yet, you can't claim that you're shooting at the Army because of something Lincoln did. He wasn't president yet. But I just to move this discussion forward, there's a sort of question I have for Tom and the current U.S. military and the educational structure of the current U.S. military at the highest levels. What do you think the biggest 20-year challenge to the intellectual side of American war making? What do you think the biggest challenge is to the intellectual side of American war making? Does that make sense? Like,
yeah. So here, I think this is something that people might find interesting. So I'm an angry opponent of the way that we have expanded and misused the word strategy, and had a tendency to conflate strategy and policy together. So let me sort of explain this as a matter. So, in our education system, so the purpose of the military is to fight and win our wars. Like, it seems like a very obvious thing, right? But in the effort to sort of fight and win our wars, we've now decided that strategy initially was, the word itself comes from generalship. That's what it means, to be a general, and be a general admiral. It's the things that they do in wars. Strategy is your idea about how you want to win a war, or in a theater of war. That's really what it means. But now we use it for everything, right? We say we have strategies for going to the grocery store. I'm gonna start in produce and work my way over to frozen foods. That's my strategy for shopping. And this is a real problem. We talk about our national security strategies. So those aren't strategies; those are policies. So let me explain what that causes. What the problem that causes is that the military, too many people in the senior levels of the military and the schools, and a lot of our schools, the senior level schools, like the one I'm at, they focus on policy questions. How do we use diplomacy and economics and information and all these other things so that we can deal with China, this competition we have with China. And they think that China is doing something, magically new. They're doing all this stuff that's warfare with us, cyber war and all of this information warfare and all this other stuff. None of that stuff's war. This is just normal. This is just normal competition between states that has happened from time immemorial. Has always been going on. It wouldn't be a military history discussion if I didn't mention Clausewitz, but, so Clausewitz, who's intimidating and hard to read. And if you haven't read him, let me just sort of give you a real quick version of what he starts with in his book On War, which is about war. You can tell by the title. It's not about statecraft and policy. And the reason why it's about war is because he says when you start using violent force, organized violent force to get after your objectives, and then your enemy responds with violent force too, you unleash you go into a different environment where there's all kinds of hatred and enmity that leads to sort of a different way of going about settling policy disputes. And it requires its own logic, its own theory. And that's what strategy is. It's about how do you deal with this unique, discrete way of getting after things. So which is kind of a long way of saying that our big question right now, we look at it's China and Russia out there, right? Everybody knows that China and Russia are out there. I would say, as a policy matter, I'm not too terribly worried about going to war with China and Russia. It's hard to see where our interests and meet up in such a way that we have to settle it with violence. Now, break, right? So if you have those conversations in the schools, in the military schools, you talk yourself out of doing what your job is. For the purposes of the military, your job is to prepare for those wars anyway, right? To think about the best ways to fight them anyway. And in doing so, if you do that really, really well, which is something we need to get back to focusing, and we are getting back to focusing on, how would you fight China? How would you fight and win a war with China? They invade Taiwan. What would you do about it? Russia goes into the Baltic states. How would we fight them? How would we get them out? How do we defend our NATO partners in these other places as part of this alliance? If you do that really, really well, then it supports the policy, right? That's what deterrence means. That's the deterrence part of the policy. We're going to make them have to use normal policy things, normal policy techniques, and maybe some that are very uncomfortable for us, like cyber stuff, like information stuff, like economic activities, in order to get what they're after. And that's good. We would prefer that. Let's compete that way, as opposed to having to kill each other. But that doesn't stop but it's not the military's job to figure out how to use all that other stuff. It's the military's job to figure out, if we had to fight, this is what it would look like. Here's how we would win. Here's what we could do. Here's how we could make this, at a minimum, so painful for them that they don't use violent action to get what they want. And unfortunately, like I said, we mix those things together too much. So what I think you'll see is and then there's some people who have these kind of half-baked theories. This idea that if militaries prepare for wars, then it's a signal that they want to fight the war. This is Woodrow Wilson's problem before World War I, when he was getting ready to get rid of the general staff because they were doing war planning for Germany before the United States entered into the war. And somebody had to explain to them, no, that's their job. That's what they're supposed to do. You'd rather they did that and got ready for it than, and so it had to be explained to him that's okay. There's a lot of stuff that needed to be explained to Woodrow Wilson.
Wait a minute. I have two other things. And a challenge to all of the panelists here. One of the things that, I get, military history is not my area of expertise, but having a good friend who studies the military makes me think about these issues, and and just how I often describe capitalism as, peace, and I describe politics as peace. A lot of those ideas come from conversations with Tom about what is the nature of war, and and how violence changes it. So it informs, it changes how I view things like lynchings. And I say, this isn't politics. This politics. You have to have peace as a precondition in order for politics to take place, because there's nothing like violence. There's nothing like it in terms of what will alter human behavior. So I would say,
Professor Tootle, let me interrupt your interruption.
Okay.
Didn't I see a survey, and it's just a poll, but didn't I see a survey that said 53% of Republicans are willing to use violence for political means in that's in 2021?
Well, I'd say that I want to see those crosstabs, because I think that some of those field surveys are
sure.
We need to spend an hour on that someday. But I want to challenge everybody who's participating right now to think about a college that you care about. You all probably care about a college somewhere. Now look at their course catalog and go to their history department and find out if they have a single military historian there, and if they teach a single class on military history. And I bet you would all be shocked to know that it just doesn't happen. And it is something in the long term that I worry about culturally in the United States, is the complete absence of political, diplomatic, and military history at colleges and universities, which are the things that people think of when they think of history. You think of politics, military, and diplomacy, and that's what's disappearing.
Yeah,
and because people are keyboard warriors, they sure talk like they're going to war, but they don't know what they're talking about.
Well, and remember, war is required. I mean, there's always some gray areas about this stuff, but war requires sort of both, organized violence, not just criminal violence, but sort of organized violence and then violent resistance. It requires both sides of that, and that unleashes this, this unique human activity that has all kinds of its own characteristics, which is why it's its own sort of field of study. And I would say I'll take Steve's point a little bit further. That I would wager that a lot of schools, a lot of university catalogs do have classes about World War II and the Civil War in them, because they get students that way, and you need to have students so you can continue to exist. But if you went into those classes, there would be very little about the actual war itself. It would end up being, very social history, social cultural sort of aspects. And the war itself would be in the margins. Very little discussion of the sort of the campaigns, the battles, the choices that are made, the decisions that are made by. At best, and I doubt this happens very often, you would get into the experiences of soldiers themselves, which is one of the sort of branches of military history, kind of combat history, new combat history. Off the top of your
head, I don't know if you know this, but off the top of your head, how many public colleges or universities have military history programs?
It's just a handful now. And
is that excluding ROTC programs, Professor Tootle?
Yeah, so our ROTC programs are generally not. They're generally not taught by the history departments. They're usually the military science department, so it's usually some sort of officer that's doing that, and they'll give them a sort of thumbnail military history thing in an ROTC program. But no, in a formal sense, you've got a handful of formal military history programs, more than I think most people would think. There is some good stuff out there, but I will say that you'll see very little, even in those, very little operational military history. So the war fighting side of it, you'll see a lot of social military history, roles of women in the military, minorities in the military. So you get into those aspects of it.
How many are granting PhDs?
Again, it'd be, where there's actually a program. There's more than there are individuals who are doing them. So I'm kind of going through my head. Certainly North Texas, Ohio State. 10 maybe. But what's interesting is not a lot of very few of the elite, what we consider sort of elite universities, your U.S. News and World Report best graduate programs, very few of those would have any kind of military history. So most of the Ivies ran off their military historians, or when their military historians retired, they didn't replace them with.
So professors, unless you have to get off to a class, I'd like to see if you're willing to go 5 or 10 minutes beyond. So maybe we have 10 or 15 minutes total, but that's not a lot, because I know 9 of the 10 people on the call. And Denise, do you have a question, or Captain Van Gilder? And then Joe's asked a lot of questions, or Colonel Rice. If you want to ask a question live, now is your opportunity. I've still got 10 more questions, so I can take off the rest of the time. But Denise, do you have a question, or Don Van Gilder? Give you 3 more seconds. There, Don, shoot.
I got a sneaky suspicion that any questions I've got are going to be covered by one of your 10, or what you've already asked.
Okay, fair enough. And I see that Denise is fine too. So Colonel Rice, you've typed in a bunch already. Why don't you now, in your own words, ask the most important question that you have for Professor Brasino? What you thinking after you hear this 45-minute conversation so far?
Hey, John, you cut out a bit on there. My connection's unstable. I really appreciated the discussion, and yeah, I was trying to help, and I was thinking about things and put some things in the chat there. But I have to drop, and I just want to see what else he has to say in the next couple of minutes. So I really appreciate, well, both of you actually, or all three of you. I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you.
Good. Appreciate you being here. Bart, you're up.
Yeah, I'll just ask the question that it's just something I've been curious about. I put it in the chat, but I'll just ask it out loud. I heard a statistic that most of the volunteers for our volunteer armed services now come from very few states. Is that correct, or do I have a misconception? And which states are they? I'm just curious, unless there's a national security reason why we can't know that. But
I think this is matter of public record stuff. Yeah. So. I'm not sure if this is the case still. I think it is. I think that the old South, the Southeast United States, is overrepresented proportionally in this stuff, and New England in particular is underrepresented in the military. You see that stuff, and then kind of everybody else sort of falls in the middle. I don't. It's interesting. I had a student who had to go do a recruiting battalion in New England. It's an interesting question. It's extremely complicated why that is, why people join the military and, a lot of the aspects go into it. I mean, the sort of simple answer is, red state, blue state stuff, but I don't know that that's quite right, because really all of our states are purple, right? I mean, we always say red state, blue state, but we're talking, 55-45, right? Yeah. So it doesn't
Professor,
make
it's probably socioeconomic though, isn't it? And in a way that's a positive. It gives you a chance to go to college.
Yeah. So that's always, that is the sort of post-Vietnam when we went to the all volunteer force. So we had a standing draft after World War II that went up to 73, I think, when they ended the draft. And then we went to an all volunteer force for a variety of reasons, some good, some bad. And we have an issue right now where we don't think about expanding the military that much in terms of bringing back a draft, what that would mean and how you'd go about that. We focus on recruitment and retention aspects of things. Yeah, if I were to get into it, like I have a theory about this. It's in no way tested to all these other things. I kind of think, I don't know. You think about places where they're good at football and where football is a big deal. We seem to get a lot of volunteers from places like that. Now, some of that's changing. I think some of that's changing because of a really strong effort to try to diversify the military. And I don't mean that in the diversity, equity, and inclusion way. I mean it in the diversify skill sets so that you can get a lot more of the computer geek types to come in. So there's a real attempt to do that so that you don't have to. But it's a huge, complicated question of why it is the way it is. A lot of people, and this is a really simple answer, right? So a lot of people, it goes back to one of the first things I said about how you don't see the military, they're out of sight, out of mind. It's out there. Those people do that stuff. Really, I think the number one indicator of whether or not you're going to join is was your dad or your mom in? I think that's I think if you were to track stuff, so you end up with people who kind of stuck. And more to the point, did your dad or mom, were they in, or were they in for a little bit longer? Were they drafted, or did they volunteer themselves? So you get these kind of long trains of people who, certainly in the officer corps, you see a lot of continuity that way. But even for enlisted types, like, hey, this is an option out there. If they're out of sight, out of mind, like certainly for me, joining the military, the only time it came up is whether or not I would go to one of the academies, go to Air Force, go to West Point, go to Naval Academy. And, at the time, it just didn't make much sense to me because I didn't really understand the idea. Kind of wish I knew what I knew now, because it's a pretty good deal. People knew like what you could do. Like, oh, you have to stay for 6 years after college. I was like, yeah, if you're smart, you stay for 20 years after college and you retire when you're 42.
And then become a professor. And you already have a PhD that they paid for. Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny though, but that's part of getting older, right? Being done with your military career and making, half of your pay for the rest of your life that is, and having benefits when you're 42 sounds like a really good deal when you're past 42. Maybe not so much when you're when you're 20. So when you put that
talk
thought
to the
in
guy
your
who
head.
has 12 years in the Army and then got out.
Yeah.
So Professor, Dane has a question that I'm going to modify just slightly. In officer basic course, we all had to read Killer Angels and write a little paper on it. And that was nice. It was a good book. And then we had a staff ride where I first met Professor Tootle at the American Enterprise Institute, where we did a staff ride out of Gettysburg and walked the grounds of Killer Angels. And so higher ground was just built into our Army officer. I mean, it was just built into our DNA, fight for higher ground. Dane has the question on the real higher ground, space. And so are there things that we need to be thinking about now that are just so unusual, or the laws of warfare changing? Or, you know, I know there's a space treaty or militarization of space that I don't know if we're doing or not, but just talk to us a little bit about the future of warfare when we're fighting with a pretty high altitude, or might fight with a pretty high altitude.
Yeah, so, you know, we have a Space Force now, right? I mean, that's it was brought into existence, last year, year before, that we have a Space Force, and we have Guardians, we're calling them. It's an interesting thing. For now, unless we're actually fighting in space, you know, Star Wars style, you know, and then you have to always think about, you know, for what purpose. I think that for now, the best way to think about space is as an extension of air, right? Which is for a long time, air is, and you know, so the control of the air, control of the ability to see yourself, see the enemies, block their ability to see you, is primarily where space is an asset in fights. Now, there's some offensive capabilities out there, and then some counter ability to see things out there. But for now, like, that's the idea. And really, the way we fight now, we fight in the future, we're going to have to probably, you know, fight to maintain that ability to see the battlefield. It gets a lot harder to fight, right? You know, you want to have air superiority, you want to have space superiority. You could see an event like in the future where it's possible that where space, you know, if we're out of planet Earth a little bit more, where space becomes a little bit more like naval type fighting, where you're fighting for control of key lanes, right? Like, yeah, so that's what our Navy does very well, is if we can keep certain aspects of the ocean open to us and to our allies, that's good, and close them off to the enemy, that's what we want. You can see where space could become that way. We're not there yet, you know, because you know what war will still come down to in the end. And you know, I'm a homer, right? I'm an Army guy, so I work for the Army. So, but I think this is right. I try to be fair about this stuff because we're a joint school and we give them all the credit in the world. For the other services, it still comes down to who can control ground, because that's where humans live. And at root, any war is fundamentally a human activity. You know, it's again so obvious that we miss it. You know, that war is about, you know, you're using violence to change minds, right? Human minds. You're trying to force them, and you're trying to find the right minds and the right number of minds in order to change their mind. Like, you know, that is what you're trying to do. You're trying to get them to accept terms that are more favorable to you and end this fighting, so we don't have to use violence anymore to get after what we're getting after. You know, so fundamentally, that violence, you know, has to involve people in order to change minds, at least so far. You know, and that might mean that you're seizing ground. It might mean that you're killing certain people. It might mean that you're destroying their ability to defend themselves, which is the classic way you win a war, right? You defeat their military forces in the field so that they cannot defend themselves anymore. So you can do whatever you want. And that's where it goes, you know, because contrary to some popular belief, you can kill your way out of a counterinsurgency. It just means a lot of killing. You know, you can kill your way out of any war, right? Like, yeah, it just means a lot of killing. And one of the most things, this goes back to one of Stephen's points. What I would say, he was asking about the sort of ordered liberty and the people we are. It's our system. When you are free people who are fighting for yourselves and your loved ones and those around you and your community as best you see it, it makes you extremely. This is the way I look at American military history, as an extension of Victor Davis Hanson's way of looking at ancient Greek warfare. That you know, free people are terrifying in war because they're fighting because they're fighting for something real and tangible that they understand. You go back to the American Revolution. I'll give you a great example. You sort of maybe bring this back to the beginning. One of the things that's really interesting in the American Revolution, you know, everybody sort of knows Washington's crossing, right? So we know this story in 1776 when they're down and out. One of the things that sets that up is that the British go into winter quarters in New Jersey, and for them they think, yeah, we go into winter quarters. So what does that mean? I always recommend people watch the TV show Turn. If you ever get a chance to watch that, it's really good for sort of showing this stuff. Like the Bill of Rights were not an abstraction for the American revolutionaries and for the people, right? This is like the real lived experience. We have a Third Amendment for a reason, right? So when you quarter into somebody's home in Europe, it's not usually their home. You know, they are, they don't own it. They live there at the pleasure of some lord, by and large, right? Like you have that view. And so they go into these winter quarters and they think that this is going to be fine because this is what you do in war in the winter, right? You go into winter quarters. Well, they're going into people's houses. And so David Hackett Fisher in his wonderful book, Washington's Crossing, has a chapter called New Jersey Rising, where he talks about this spontaneous rebellion that sort of forms out of the people of New Jersey, because they're like, get out of my house. You're in my house. It's my house. You're sitting, like, you don't just go into winter quarters here. They literally, they're not building new things. They're going into people's homes that they live in. Those are people owned by people, free landholders. And Victor Davis Hansen's points. So they just rise up, and Washington uses this. His crossing is enabled by the fact that the British are finding themselves fighting these New Jersey militias, spontaneous New Jersey militias that are fighting all over the place to get the British out of their houses and their Hessian troops that are with them. So it's sort of this is not something that a lot of people are used to, but by extension, that is what we're always doing when we're fighting. The United States is always doing this when we're fighting. It's always sort of linked back to this threat to liberty at home, to what we hold most dear, and we actually hold it. And it's not, and it's interesting how violent and nasty it gets because it's so high on our hierarchy of needs, right? It's not just survival. It's survival in a certain way, which makes us even more dangerous when we fight. And that's a pretty important thing to remember about American military history and why it gets so nasty, why so many of our fights end up being why we bring such overwhelming power to this, because it really matters to us. Sometimes it's easy to see that existential link. You've got the British in your house. Sometimes it's a little bit harder to see, like in a place like Vietnam. But it's always there. It is always there. You know, we can always like walk that logic back.
Yeah, fascinating, Professor. So we are way over time, but Frank, you're our most consistent person that dialed in. Are you good? Okay. Ben, you all right? Okay. Tony, you want to add anything? All right. So Professor Tootle, take us, finalize this, and then we'll let you have the last word, Professor Brasino. But give an overview of what happened today and what we should really be thinking about.
Well, I think for most people, it's important to not put questions of violence in the military into some sort of separate box. And that what I would like to see culturally is a reinvigoration of the study of military history, because it is by far the most popular form of history, but it is something that exists outside of the academics. And if you were to take your average elementary school teacher or junior high school teacher or high school teacher, that person probably never had any military history education by someone who was an expert in military history. And I think that is a real shame because it is such an important part of how we should structure and value our liberties. And I do have my question I just thought of as something that would be a curveball to throw to Tom. and especially if I make him answer this quickly, see how fast he can do this. What is the biggest misconception that people have about the use of artillery in World War I, World War II, and Iraq?
The biggest misconception that we have about the use of artillery. I don't know that many people have any conceptions at all about the use of artillery in World War I, World War II, and
World War I.
Iraq.
Let me say what the conception is, and you correct it. That the lines in World War I were static.
Yeah, so I will say I'm writing a book about the Meuse-Argonne campaign in World War I. I think the biggest, I'll just say World War I in general, I'll take it out to that point. The biggest misconception we have about World War I, which leads to us not studying World War I in the United States very well, is that we believe that we fought in Flanders Fields like the British. The American understanding of World War I is almost entirely as if we were fighting alongside the British on the Somme. And in these trenches, and guys kicking a soccer ball and blowing a whistle, and they're charging out of these trenches. United States Americans did not really fight in trenches in World War I. This is like sort of a number one thing about the war. Americans had to fight in a much more open, moving fight almost everywhere where Americans fought in any real numbers. It's a much more interesting story than what is commonly understood about that. And again, I think that comes from having a perspective that is entirely dominated by the British, including the memory of the British fight, which I also think is a kind of a perversion of the reality of the memory for a lot of those British guys. I don't think it's quite as grim as we've made it out to be for those guys, which is a really interesting sort of testament to people's ability to deal with terrible situations and come out of them. And I think that's because the majority of those British troops, and certainly American troops, believe they were on the good side, right? Which is really what this comes down to. This, one of my final kind of thought on this is, we are suffering from the United States. We won the Cold War, but we took a lot of body blows, ideologically, culturally, intellectually. And this has led us to have, here's another Hansen thing he talks about in his book, Carnage and Culture, in the Tet chapter. We're self-critical, which is one of our great strengths, but our self-criticism has become like pathological. It's become sort of out of control in how we look at ourselves. And we forget, that, and in our attempt to be super nuanced, we've nuanced, a basic understanding of good and bad, or maybe better and worse out of everything we do, which is not to say that we're purely good, but we've definitely been better in the wars we've fought. And we can anticipate, I think, with great confidence that any war we fight, we will be doing it as best we can for a result that will be better for not only for us, but for everyone. We would like to, if we have to fight people as a rule, we would like to leave as close as we can some sort of system of ordered liberty as best we can, or at least allow the people to make the choice to join into an alliance of our sort of system of ordered liberty that is better for them too. I think you see this with Europe. You see it with a lot of the world. How the world looks now is a lot more American than it was before, and I think the world's better for it. And I mean, I know the world's better for it. And in those places where we were unable to get ordered liberty into those places on that sort of American type model, not the exact American model, because we're our own thing, what we've seen is some pretty horrifying things. North Korea to this day is an example of that. China is still that way. Russia is still that way. The places that anywhere the communists went, they didn't leave a happy legacy. And so that's important for us to always remember that. And along those lines, if I were to make a book recommendation for everybody, it's Walter McDougall, Promised Land, Crusader State. Promised Land, Crusader State, particularly the first half of that book about America's sort of Old Testament. You want to know why we fight and how we look at the world? It's when we see those traditions that he talks about in the first half of the book threatened to this day. And it's not until and when they're all threatened and they all boil down to liberty at home, you start to see that's when the United States is willing to go to war. As terrible as war is, as famously said, it's not the worst of all things, right?
Let me follow up with my summarize. What is the American way of war in 2 or 3 sentences?
Yeah, so I would say I think, and I've been working on this for a while, I think the American way of war there's kind of two. There's an American mind for war that's out there, right? We have 2 types of wars. We have wars that involve American citizens either directly or American citizens are threatened directly, or American citizens join those wars directly. And then we have wars that are fought by the professionals, right? So in the wars that are fought by the professionals, this is where you get the sort of dissatisfaction or the much more limited objectives, not a tendency to use overwhelming force and all that stuff. If the American people get involved, we want to win, and we want to win quick. And overwhelmingly, and get it over with. People do not want to serve in the military for life, but they're willing to do their duty and fight for a while, as long as we're getting after it. Where we get into trouble in wars, where we really struggle, is when it feels like citizens are involved or citizens are involved, and we are not willing, for whatever reason, to use as much force as is necessary to get the result we would like. So you see that with Vietnam. I think you see that with the Iraq and Afghanistan. I think a lot of the dissatisfaction is that American people felt like they were attacked directly, because they were, and felt like they needed, like this was going to become a citizens type war where we go over and win, but we chose to fight it like a professional war. So
the American way of war, if citizens are involved, is get after it.
Yeah, it's pretty no holds barred.
So Professor, I'm very hesitant to ask this. So if you just say pass, that's actually probably the better answer. Is there any chance, I see this on a truly a daily basis, executives and political leaders in Colorado, and I have friends in other states as well, who are truly concerned about some version of an informal civil war of violence for political means in the United States today. It's common conversation now, and we read about it regularly. What's your prediction? Is there any chance, I'm not talking military per se, but the military has to send a letter off to the Washington Post saying we don't get involved in elections. I mean, this seems to be somewhat unusual. Can you just address this in a minute or less?
Yeah, I'd say in American history, I think it's hard to imagine, geography matters, right? So where would these potential armies gather? Where would they, how would they come together in order to find, I think, I know there's a lot of anger out there. There's a lot of angst out there about stuff. This is pretty normal for Americans. We're pretty obnoxious. We do this a lot. It'll probably pass. But I do think it is important that we do the kinds of thing we're doing right now, that we talk about this stuff, that we reaffirm the fundamental goodness of the United States, which is, so all this talk about curriculum for students and everything like that. I think most people, what is it? There's how many people are on Twitter? It's not that many, right? And 10% of them do like 90% of the stuff that's on there. Twitter's not America. Facebook's not America. That's not what, that's not the lives we live in our country. I really believe that most of us are my day-to-day life does not really have much to do with the stuff that I see people screaming about all the time. My day-to-day life is taking my kids to field hockey practice and football practice, and going to barbecues with friends, and going hiking, or going fishing, or people who are into motorsports and all of that stuff. That's what their daily life is about. And in those lives, they're hanging out with people all the time who probably politically disagree with them, and they have no problem with it at all. Or people of all kinds of diverse backgrounds, black, white, brown, yellow, gay, straight, whatever, and they don't care. They just get on with their lives. I mean, that's what most of us are doing. American people are fundamentally good people, get along with each other, and we're just letting we're kind of letting, like, almost literally the inmates run the asylum, and we're just getting too caught up in this stuff. And take a pause from it, take a step back, go enjoy your regular life, go mountain climbing, go for your runs, hang out with people, do that stuff, go play ultimate frisbee in the park, go do all that stuff that we do, go to parades, go to barbecues, do that stuff, and life will be all right. Like, we're we're doing the right stuff. People are doing the right things. I find a lot of this stuff to be, when I hear the lectures about telling me what bothers us right now is that people are telling us what we think and who we fundamentally are. And that is the most fundamental violation of freedom that there is, to take away people's, their personal sovereignty, their personal ability, identity, and tell them what it is and how that defines them. And I think that's what's causing a lot of anger, because I think all of us have these stories about this. I find it hard to believe that I'm, I've been in, locker rooms with kids, because I coach sports, and, in locker rooms with kids of all different backgrounds, and, and you're celebrating with them, or you're mourning with them because they lost, and you're crying together and hugging. And I find it hard to believe that experience is trumped by the most superficial characteristics that we're saying are defining for all of us. But that's real life. Like, that's the real life. And I think that's probably all of your real lives too, as long as you get away from your computers and your screens and don't make, the latest, the issue of the day, define you.
Awesome.
And hey, most importantly, how good at wrestling is my godson?
Well, we'll see. He'll be, hopefully we'll find out. He's got 3 years of high school wrestling in Pennsylvania, and I guess we'll find out how good he is. He has potential, put it that way.
Wow, I knew you knew each other, but I didn't know you were godson stuff. So wow, very nice, professors. Last call, either Professor Tootle or Brasino. Are you mad or sad that I didn't ask you some question that you thought was urgent? Of course, there was a bunch of stuff we didn't get to, the Middle East and Israel, and I mean, there's just a ton of stuff we didn't get to. But is there something that you really just have to leave with us before we hang up in just a minute? Either one of you.
I guess I would say one thing when I visited Tom out there, just a takeaway. I spent some time with some of his students, and what was striking to me was just how, number one, how normal they were, and number two, how smart they were. And so for anybody who is wondering what kind of people go to the Army War College, I think most people would be struck by two things: that they're pretty normal and they're really smart. And that it actually made me feel better about the military, to see like, oh, we got a lot of normal, smart, good people trying to learn in our military,
and from all over the world.
Yeah.
Let me add to that too. Like, it was one of these things too. I did a staff ride to Gettysburg last year, in the last couple of years, and one of the students we had in our class was from Vietnam, and this is right as all of the tearing down the statues and stuff was happening, and I go to, very few people are as harsh as I am about declaring the Confederates traitors, and not celebrating them for that reason. But I think we could at least muster up, 2 cheers for reconciliation. It is a better world that we have the American South as part of the United States, and that that, like Lincoln said, we must be friends, right? And figuring that out, and sort of that was kind of brought home, like across the street from my office, there's a British flag. Carlisle Barracks, part of the American Revolution. There's a British flag hanging there, and I always think, I'm glad that we're friends with Great Britain, right? And I'm glad that we had a Vietnamese student there. For as hard as we fight wars, and as willing as we are to go all in on these wars, we're also willing to reconcile after. And I think it's part of the greatness and goodness of the United States of America and American people to do that, and it's worth keeping that in mind. While recognizing that, like, the war maybe had to happen anyway.
Yeah, so. And Professor, I assume you concur with the thought that Americans are pretty good at this. The Marshall Plan after World War II, what MacArthur did in Japan, American Caesar is a book I read early on. It seems like we're pretty good at forgiving and building up, rather than just hatred for generations or centuries.
Yeah, and I think to a degree that why we struggle with it sometimes is because the people we're doing with have zero expectation that we're sincere, So that's one of those things, like in a place like Iraq, right? Like that, yeah, when you're so used to being under strong men and authoritarians and nasty regimes, it's hard to believe that somebody wants to come there and isn't going there to conquer and to take, but like going there to liberate. Yeah. And all that means.
If you ever need a subject matter expert, that's what Colonel Rice did, who was on the call with us for a long time. That was his full-time job in several tours of Iraq. Civil awareness. He was a mayor and a state legislator here in Colorado, and then probably a major in the Army at that time. But
yeah, right. And go ahead.
No, you should finish. Why don't you finish us off and we'll hang up.
Okay. Well, I just want to say thank you guys for this, and I appreciate this. And we'll spread try to spread the word for people. It is always my thing. Like, it's fraught with things, but the kind of happy warrior thing is an important one to keep in mind. Having some optimism and focusing on positives is difficult in our environment, but it's hard to, look at the bookshelves behind me or look out my window at the trees and wood and travel around this country and see how great it really is, and all the amazing people, interesting people, different backgrounds and stuff, and we're pretty incredible place, and it's sort of sad the way we don't see that. We don't teach it to ourselves. We don't, we have trouble seeing that. So it's nice to talk to people from other countries who I think see us better than we see ourselves. We send out survey like your survey. And I hate polls and surveys. I think they're terrible. They're usually horribly done. But we send out surveys to the rest of the world, like almost begging them to tell us how bad we are. And the results are always sort of interesting. And it's great. Americans great. It's awesome. Yeah, like the United States. Yeah, I'd love to go there. That's a neat place. Americans who come here. Some of them are kind of obnoxious, but they have good hearts. Basically, America's like that. The old Warner Brothers thing. The old cartoon with it was Abominable Snowman. We're like the big lovable idiot. I want to hug you and love you and make you my own, and then we crash stab. Oh, I'm so sorry, I broke it. That's us. It's hard not to like us for that reason. Right. Sorry, we didn't mean to break your village. we really didn't. Our bad. And they're like, oh, you're big stupid oaf. We love you. So keep that in mind. We're a big stupid oaf, but we're lovable.
Love it. Well, Professor Brasino, this was a real honor to have you with us today. And again, we're building a library of topics that we hope citizens will look at in the future, and this will likely be one of the most important ones. So thank you for your time. Professor Tootle, this is your co-show. Last word for us all.
Just thanks. And somebody in the comments said they wanted a part 2, and I think it would be great to do a part 2 and a part 3, and I'm sure people have an unlimited number of questions about the military and military history. So I'd love to have Tom back all the time.
Awesome. Thank you all. Professor, great job. Well done. Professor Tootle, honored to be your friend. Okay, have a great day, you all. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.